Hello and welcome to another episode of the J Plus R Movie Podcast. And on this episode, we will be discussing Let the Right One In and Let Me In. Jack, would you like to give the plot synopsis of Let the Right One In?
Let the Right One In follows the relationship between two 12-year-olds, Oscar and Ellie, and it kind of explores how their relationship develops and functions as they're both quite lonely and loner people. And then see throughout the film the development of the reveal that Ellie is a vampire, and then how that affects their relationship, and kind of helps solve their problems in a mutual way.
Good summary.
Pretty
Yeah,
ambiguous there. I'm proud of myself for that.
So Let the Right One In, I was very, very impressed by it. It's definitely one of the most unique vampire movies I've seen because it kind of takes an interesting perspective in that it's an adolescent viewpoint. And that adolescent viewpoint to me is the thing that separates it from vampire fiction that's more about adults or teenagers. What I think is really effective about the film is that it communicates that mindset while still being a movie for adults.
It's more innocent than a teenage perspective would be, but it's also kind of like pure and unadulterated macabre fascination that you kind of get from Oscar when he's around Ellie, especially when he finds out about her true nature, which a lot of the time it deals with quite childlike issues. So it deals with things like bullying and the rage that comes from that in a pretty vicious way.
The relationship between adults and children as well. There's a bit of a contrast in Let the Right One In between Oscar's parents and the person pretending to be Eli's father. The relationship between Hakan, who's pretending to be Eli's father but isn't actually her father, seems kind of closer, but you can also tell that it's a lot darker as well. Whereas, although Oscar's parents are kind of distant from him, there's still more genuine love and affection there. But despite those differences, Oscar is totally isolated from the world. And I think that what's interesting about the film is that I almost felt that Oscar was kind of one of the more evil characters.
I don't think traditional good and evil concepts apply to this film. I like that about it because Oscar's I have never seen more of a school shooter in the making vibe off of a kid. Actually.
Yeah, well, I'd say a serial killer in the making, actually.
I think it's quite clear that by the ending that Oscar is going, is going to be Hakan. It's very, very screwed up, their relationship, and obviously I think it's similar in a way as well because Hakan has clearly got a kind of attraction to Ellie. It's something that almost seems like a perverse form of love, although Ellie again must be something like a couple hundred. So it's a complicated dynamic.
In the original book, from what I can tell, they actually flat out go into detail and reveal that Hakan was basically just a pedophile that she's kind of stringing along in a sense. Whereas in the film, I didn't really get that vibe. I mean, he could be. I don't remember any big hints that he was one. What they're basically suggesting, it's not a father-daughter relationship, but it's also not a romantic relationship either. It's kind of a more like an affectionate caretaker almost. But it's a very dark form of an affectionate caretaker because in terms of his caretaking involves him going out and murdering people, but being very, very inept at it. And that was kind of interesting because in any other film, typically you'd think to yourself that this character seems like an idiot, but it's more they have him do things that are a bit short-sighted, but his short-sightedness kind of gets across the fact that he's old, not as good as he used to be, and ultimately in need of being replaced.
Yeah, exactly, which kind of then makes sense with Oscar, who's clearly being groomed for that role. I think what's interesting, especially about Hakan, is the kind of it doesn't shy away from the brutal reality that is his life. It's almost like Ellie gets protected in a way. Oscar clearly doesn't have an adult's understanding of the situation. And Hakan's the one who's got to go through all the horrific things, like the bit where he has to pour acid on his face so that he doesn't get identified by the police. Jesus. Yeah. Or the fact that he hides a body in a local lake and then that kind of gets discovered, which is less than ideal.
He does seem like he's been doing this for a long time, but at the same time, though, the way that translates onto Oscar, we're seeing an implied history. And with Oscar, we're seeing the beginnings of a potential history between him and Eli, because what I think is definitely the heart of the film, and what makes it also stand out from other vampire stories, is that it's really not a horror film, at all. it's kind of one where the horror elements are very much in the background. It's more heavily, it's like a puppy love romance.
It's a very dark drama that's got bits of romance and bits of horror in it. It kind of presents things to you, and it doesn't really colour your interpretation of it in any certain way. So you're kind of just left there with scenes, and you've got to go, okay.
Some scenes in it that are actually fairly sweet. Like, I think the best example of this is kind of towards the end, because weirdly enough, there was something quite heartfelt about the ending, because like throughout the film, Oscar is getting like picked on by these other kids. And at the end of it, you've got that disturbing bit where they're basically telling him to hold his breath or they'll cut his eye out. And there's something about the ending, like where Eli comes in and saves him, that is quite touching. But at the same time, she's also just killed a bunch of people, and you know, this as a result is going to force them to have to like run away from home. But there is something quite sweet about the ending, despite the darkness.
You know, you see Oscar at the lowest point, and you do form a connection to Oscar, even though he's a monster in the making. You still, I think, I literally think it's the bully child effect. You're automatically primed to feel sympathy for a bully child. It's actually one of my favourite plot devices, because you can get away with so much abused by the world, and then they snap. You get to get away with it, and I think it's interesting that, you know, one of Ellie's lines is easy. I need to kill you, want to. Why don't we kind of, you know, quid pro quo? Well, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that is.
I mean, Oscar does like give some kind of response where he's saying like, "Well, I don't just want to kill anybody," or that, like, I'm paraphrasing. But that's basically what he says. Like, I don't just want to kill anybody. I like the fact that Oscar probably wouldn't just kill anybody. You know, based on him totally accepting the murder by Eli or the husband that comes looking for revenge, and also even just based on him so gladly wanting to kill the bullies, it's like, you know, that eventually at a certain point he's probably going to be okay with killing if he needs to help Eli.
I think it's very, very clear that he would. You can tell he's on the cusp of kind of acting, and I think the vampire almost represents temptation for him. Not only romantic temptation by exploiting his very burgeoning sexuality in the film, temptation for the darker side of life, and it's almost just like vampire represents just committing to that shadow self, which is quite an interesting thing. I think the scene that is just quite uncomfortable is the scene where they agree to go steady, because it's kind of like they're like 12. What the fuck? But it's also played as a sweet moment between the two of them.
That does offset the darkness of the story, but it also arguably makes it more dark. It's a bit darker because you realize there's always something that is kind of corrupting this innocence, whether it's but both of them are corrupting themselves, and they're also corrupting each other. Like, definitely the most interesting characteristic of the film is the characterization of Eli, because although she's a vampire, she's not really the villain at all. In fact, I'd say she's more of a tragic monster.
And she's trying to relate to the world, and you can see that she's not able to connect at the start because of everything she's been through, and the fact that, because she's clearly hundreds of years old, you know, not really able to get close to anyone anyway because of her nature as a vampire. But then you could tell that she wants these things, and I think it's why the relationship with Oscar works. It does feel like a mutual relationship, which is why you buy into it.
Also kind of dependable as well. Yeah. There's a sense of dependency. One of them needs the other. You know, one of them cannot function without the other. Ellie come in without Oscar inviting her in, just in the same way that, like, Oscar can't fight back against these bullies or get out of his situation or do anything without Eli, but also Eli knows that she's not going to be able to live in any kind of a good, safe, non-dangerous situation without Oscar eventually fulfilling the role that Hakan fills. So let's talk about the direction, because that to me is the strongest and most impressive aspect of the film.
Scenes have a really great flow to them. I like the perspective that we get of the alley, almost like an objective look at what Hakan is doing. It doesn't really get too close to Hakan or Ellie when they do their murders. Whenever Oscar's around, the perspective is his. It gives us a bit of a weird audience insert, to be honest, but an audience insert, and we get to kind of understand how the vampires operate in this world and how it's different to normal. I think it's used to great effect when Oscar doesn't invite in originally, and he's literally just there bleeding to death until Oscar says, "Oh my God, I invite you in." I think that was, done really well because its perspective was picked correctly. I think, the director managed to get really good performances out of their actors, which we'll get onto. The themes are just really, really well handled. It's the choices that they make and how much they show kind of gets the loneliness and isolation. Especially, I love the opening scenes in the park, the in between of the apartment blocks, because they don't really get close to each other for the first few
Mhm.
scenes at all. When they finally do get to a point where they're closer to each other, they're mostly inside in a confined space. I just found that really, really interesting for the relationship. It's like to the outside world, they can't have one level that they do and they can. I find that really quite fascinating.
It's just a beautifully shot movie because, like, despite the cold, slightly muted color scheme, it's still a very beautiful looking film. The way that like Thomas Alfredson kind of films it, always manages to film it in a way that kind of draws you in and adds atmosphere. Because there isn't necessarily a lot of dialogue in the film. I mean, there is, but there's also not. There are a lot of scenes that don't feel like they have as much dialogue as what you typically expect in a movie scene. And it works because it gets across this very like cold atmosphere, but with an underlying warmth. I think the cold can especially be felt in the setting as well.
I think we'd be remiss not to acknowledge Hoyt van Hoffman.
Yeah, he's definitely one of the best DPs around.
Fantastic work with this film. I mean,
Yeah, I agree.
I love the color palette because it makes where they are feel just bleak and horrible, which is why Oscar doesn't want to be there in the first place. But it
Yeah.
also kind of is able to use and shape light really, really well. Like the shaping of light in this film, I really, really appreciate.
I can think of a couple of other shots that really stood out to me. A couple of the conversations that moved kind of backwards and forwards from the right to the left. Other things too, like the bit where she's like on the building and then she suddenly starts up. Like probably my favorite one, the one that impressed me the most was when you have the wife who'd just been turned into a vampire and she's like walking and there's like a car driving up and the way that the light framed her, it wowed me.
It's the window scenes that I really, really like, especially at the hospital window with Hakan, just perched on that still, because there's just the really like white fall off from her face that just makes her look super pale, which she is obviously, but it really highlights the almost otherworldliness of her character. And then obviously you then get the brilliant reflection shot of his disfigured face as well, which really gets some more of the horror aspect up. And then obviously once the window opens and it cuts outside as the life is ending, you get to see her look down on what's left of the relationship. I just think that really, really works. An oddly tender moment.
Even though she's killing him, it's kind of like an assisted suicide essentially. Like she bites him and like she doesn't turn him, but she bites him on the throat and then throws him off the building as well. What he also does very well is that he kind of manages to give you a film that feels kind of real. There's something about it that feels very grounded in reality, especially with like, the minimal use of violence as well. Like the violence is fairly like held back. I think that then as a result almost makes you believe that a vampire could exist in reality. There's very little that like makes you think to yourself, oh yeah, this is just like a movie monster or something like that. It handles multiple storylines strongly as well, because the film has like 3 different plot lines as well, kind of 4. There's obviously Ellie and Oscar's romance, but there's also Ellie's story, there's Oscar's story, and then there's the story of the group of people that are affected by Ellie's kills, which I think is there to kind of almost remind us that despite the fact that Eli is a tortured soul, her actions still kind of have consequences and they destroy regular people.
Her very nature makes her a monster, despite the fact that she tries so hard not to be. And then I think that's really shown in the stories of Lack and Virginia. Lack should be the protagonist in a typical vampire film. I mean, he's the policeman investigating the horrific murder.
Going out on his own, it's more of a single-minded vigilante.
Vigilante that, yeah, he's the vigilante kind of going after the horrific killer. Usually that Van Helsing, effectively.
Whoever the typical person is that's brought into the whole vampire thing because a person they love is attacked or something like that. If that's a character trope.
And then obviously Virginia, who gets attacked for the blood, obviously, and then ends up becoming a vampire, to be fair, because she does burst into flames when the suns come up, which is just a horrific fate. That in itself, it kind of just like shows the impact of what Ellie is, because in truth, it wasn't the most loving relationship in the world, but that still clearly left an emotional impact, given that Lack went and tried to kill Eli when he could, and then
kind of gave a bit of a human perspective. And it was interesting as well to see like this regular like Swedish husband guy just become again kind of a vigilante. At the end of it, he was going to kill a child. Obviously he had good reason to, but he was going to kill a child, and then Oscar helps him die. That was quite a good reaction as well. It was a very casual response of, okay, I'm not going to look at this, from Oscar. But I still found it to be like in character, because although he seems like a sociopath, I can kind of tell that he doesn't actually enjoy violence, or at least he doesn't, like, when he sees it, he doesn't necessarily, although, well, actually, no, I'm wrong in that sense. I don't think he enjoys violence if it's on somebody that he doesn't want to hurt. But like in the bit, and this really stood out to me, in the bit with the bullies where they're on that field trip and he whacks the bully in the ear, it cuts to him giving this really creepy look. It's probably the creepiest moment in the film, to me anyway, because he just looks like he's getting so much enjoyment out of seeing that bully in pain.
I mean, he clearly is.
Move on to that. Acting from the two leads, really strong, hard roles for like kids to play because neither of them are really typical kids at all, but they still make their roles feel kind of natural. They have great chemistry on screen. The biggest surprise to me is that the actress was dubbed. She was still dubbed by a Swedish woman with a much deeper voice, and that never ever sounded like dubbing at all.
No, Drop, that is probably one of the best examples of ADR I've ever seen.
And you can't like tell from the performance that the voice isn't matching.
I just think the film in general was just technically brilliant. It worked really, really well on a narrative level. Its cinematography was genius. It balanced its themes really, really effectively. Quite clear that we are both fans of the first one. We think it works. We're not kind of gone over its main themes. And I think it's time to go with what should be the same film, but somehow is not.
This is going to come as a bit of a shock to you. I think objectively as a film, Let the Right One In is better. But I have to be honest, something about the remake connected with me more than the original. First of all, what it was is, like, one thing I felt that it did better than the original is it gave me a sense of the world around the protagonists, what society was like. Like, the original gave us that, obviously, through, like, you know, just the regular people. But what Let Me In does is, like, first of all, it's like, you know, it's American set. It also kind of makes that world feel somewhat real and tangible in a way that I didn't really feel with the original. With this one, I was like, feel like this is the real world, and this is a world that did exist at a certain point. And I think that's done well through the usage of certain background elements, like, you know, the Ronald Reagan speech that you see, or even the constant mention from the cop about the fact that like these killings might be related to some kind of satanic cult, which was a reflection to me of how, like, you know, satanic panic was very common in the 80s. And there are other examples as well. But stuff like that, I think, made me almost feel like I could imagine this happening more so. I think I felt more emotionally invested in this story than I did Let the Right One In.
I don't think the remake is terrible per se. But I think its biggest problem is it kind of tones down the more uncomfortable parts of the original film. And although it's not like a conventional narrative, it kind of fits the conventions of A, a typical horror film, and B, a more morally clear story than the original does. There was absolutely zero suggestion of Hakan being a paedophile in this version, which there is suggestion in Let the Right One In. It's there. That's not so clear in this one because they obviously, you know, they go to much greater lengths to imply that they'd met as kids and fallen in love, and the same thing that was happening with Owen and Abby at this point had happened with.
I think he's called Thomas. I think.
Yeah, cool. We'll go with that. It's a much clearer cut father and child kind of relationship, even though that's not what it is, but it's much more clearly set up within that role than the original film. It's a lot clearer that there is not a love interest at this point, while Let the Right One In doesn't do that as much. It doesn't make that quite as clear. I felt like the actual deaths were toned down a bit in terms of like the feel of them. Like the original felt cold and observed, like the murder was kind of like a fact. Well, I found Let Me In because of certain perspectives they chose, like, you know, being in the middle of the forest, for example, and seeing the back seat and seeing the killer with the mask on, which, to be fair, is actually a great idea that Hakan probably should have borrowed, to be honest. Because we're locked into that perspective, it seems very personal.
Like, a solid thing that Let the Right One In did is that it made the murder seem like a process that just needed to be fulfilled. And that's not quite the case in Let Me In. Because in Let Me In, it does feel more like a need than a process. I don't know if I basically just said the same thing there, but so I agree with you on it feeling more personal, but I don't think that that's a change made for the worse. In fact, I actually think it's a bit smarter because it gets you to root for this version of Hakan in a way that you didn't in the first one.
I feel like that's the wrong choice. Like from
what
this story, because the whole point of the story is how tough the situation is.
Yeah.
And to me, by making it personal and getting you to actually actively root for it, rather than having to make the active choice to root for Hakan. Oh, sorry, Tom. Makes the situation more comfortable.
I'd actually say it makes it a bit more uncomfortable. So to give you an example, and I think that The scenes with Thomas are some of the best in the film. And part of the reason why is because you have that question that you're asking yourself of like, why am I rooting for this guy to win? Because I know that he's going to kill an innocent person. Like the scenes manage to be suspenseful, yet they also put you into like a moral quandary. Like, they blur the moral line, and as a result, although they might be traditional suspense sequences, they also again ask certain moral questions.
I really disagree with you. I think by putting in that perspective, it didn't question it as harshly at all because it didn't present it as an event. I felt more akin to watching. It's not quite like a gangster film, but I felt it was more akin to watching a gangster film.
Like a hit.
Psychologically primed to enjoy as an audience. There's a lot more enjoyment that you can get out of the kills and Let Me In. The mere way they construct it has an element of cinematic pleasure in it. The only scene that I would say that's present in the original was the swimming pool scene, which is just cinematic pleasure on blast. Let Me In, which is a lot more suggestive. I'm assuming because it was rating, to be fair. There's a lot more suggestive in that final swimming pool scene. Hides the brutality, which, it doesn't make it as ugly, but at the same time also kind of gives you the sense of removal better. I think it's the one scene where it does that. But throughout the rest of the film, that because we are primed to enjoy violence in a certain way on screen, the murder that you get in the American version, you can always take pleasure in it, not because they're hitting gore quotes and things like that, but because they've constructed shots in the right way to do it. And in my way, it plays it a lot safer and doesn't get you challenged as much. Like I feel like you could watch Let the Right One In and not properly sympathise with the characters and get the wrong quandary to it, or you could watch it fully sympathising with the characters, or you could be in that constant state of discomfort. With Let Me In, I didn't see any reason particularly to not support the characters. It's the biggest problem in the film because it doesn't, to me, fully get across the kind of moral quandary of it because it doesn't give you a chance to not identify.
I still don't necessarily agree. In terms of like more comparison, made Oscar more sympathetic. I think that works, and the reason why I think it works is first of all, it makes his plight and his arc that much more tragic. I think it adds a bit of an emotional core to the film. And to me, it makes this version of Eli Abby both less villainous but more villainous. I found her in this film to be a more ambiguous character than she was in the original film, because in the original film, that's not to say that she wasn't ambiguous, because she was, but in the original film I could tell exactly what she was, whereas with this version I couldn't really put a pin on where she lied morally, because I could see elements of both good and evil. I mean, there was definitely more evil, but I could see enough elements of good to where I didn't entirely feel that she fit the villain role. Although they do increase the monster element of her, in Eli's case, we never see her go for any kind of a transformation, whereas with Abby in this film, her eyes go strange, she turns into more of a monster.
To me, that's less effective because Let Me In actually really works really, really well as a horror film. I think in comparison, it doesn't work as well, just because I think by making her so explicitly a monster, again, it's primed to be familiar. I think the biggest problem I've got with Let Me In is it feels too familiar. The whole point about the original was that it wasn't familiar. It was a presentation of a vampire that could plausibly operate like a normal vampire, but wasn't quite the same thing, which makes it a lot more complicated, kind of head pounding and uncomfortable. And to me, that's why the original is a bit more effective, because it just feels wrong. Everything about it feels wrong in a way that Let Me In doesn't.
Having these moments where you see Abby as more of a monster than she was in the original film, that makes the moments where she's being very nice to Owen, more ambiguous, but also more complex. You see that she does very much have two sides. She does have a good side and a bad side. I don't know, just that I feel made her harder to pin down. I couldn't pin down entirely if she was a good monster or a monster pretending to be good.
For me, what I liked about Ellie in the first film is that she's completely amoral. Like, good and bad do not apply. Like, it's not a thing that she even acknowledges. I find that really interesting. After a few centuries, and with the powers that she has, it would just stop applying. And I like the fact that even Oscar, we don't, with Oscar in the original film, there's a lot more of the kind of like cold good bad thing going on. I actually think he's slightly more sympathetic in the Swedish version, purely because he's still fantasizing about killing his classmates in Let Me In, which throws out massive school shooter vibes. I would say that makes him less sympathetic because you're just there like, oh Jesus, This could go
Mm.
so badly because you're American.
There is that kind of cultural difference, but what they kind of ground it in is they ground it in. So Owen in the remake, he is still like toned down. He still has those tendencies, don't get me wrong, but he does come off as a much sweeter, more fragile person than he did in the original film. I feel again that adds a sort of tragic element to his moments of darkness. In particular, the moment that really stood out to me, and this was like it was a powerful moment. I actually thought it was kind of a genius like take on the original scene. You have this like detective who's kind of taking the role of Lackey in the original, and he breaks into the flat, and they have the similar like death. Only the way that they do it is instead of Oscar just closing the door and walking away, Owen kind of stands there and he more clearly reacts to it and sees it. And then you have like the detective who's reaching out, and then Owen reaches out, and you think he's reaching out towards his hand, but then he's reaching out to the door and closes it. It gets across both like the sympathy element of I can't watch this, but it also gets across like he's choosing to accept this. You know, he knows that this is bad, and he doesn't like it, but he's choosing to accept it anyway. Stuff like that is what made me emotionally connect to him as a person. And you could say that that's less interesting because you could argue it's more interesting to have like a protagonist that isn't maybe the most sympathetic, but in a story like this, investment is key. And to me, it made me feel more invested in him. And the same goes for the way that they handle the bullying as well, because in the original film, the bullying is pretty bad, but it's not that horrible. But in Let Me In, they really dial it up, and
Yeah.
I found those to be some of the scariest moments in the film. Like particularly like that bit, that wedgie was fucking horrifying. That was just, it shouldn't sound brutal, but the way they execute it, it just comes off as really brutal and disturbing.
Yeah.
And the same goes for the way that they characterize the lead bully Kenny in this one. He just seems evil. He just seems like evil incarnate. But despite that, what they actually did was they didn't make his like moment where he got hit and injured into a satisfying moment. And later on, you see the brief bit where he has an older brother that kind of picks on him and even calls him a little girl, which is what he calls Owen. Those two scenes and the bit of him at the end when he's kind of telling his brother to like not drown Owen, even that stuff, it's like you made this character way more evil, yet you made him more complex as well. And that was stuff that I liked. What did you think of the bullies in comparison?
I think they both worked very, very well, if I'm being honest. They're both vicious little shits. Right. What the hell kind of bullies are these schools? What the fuck were they eating? God. But
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think they were a bit more complicated than let the right one in, because you did have one of them that was, very much going, okay, this has gone a bit far now, guys.
Yeah, at the end, yeah.
Which I liked that scene. I also quite liked that Eli spared
one of them, yeah.
one of them as well. That did just reinforce the complexity of the morality, because on the one hand, you're seeing dismembered feet and loads of blood and smoke, and you're like, oh my God, what the hell? Those are children, Jesus. And then you're seeing, I guess it was just the bad kids. I guess that's okay. And then you catch yourself. Let Me In doesn't quite have that, I feel.
To give you an example, at the end of it, you don't see that there's one who was spared. All of them got killed. But there's something about that I like, because although I like that in Let the Right One In, the one who didn't seem as into it was left alive, I also thought to myself, would that really happen? Like, I wondered if that would actually happen. Like, I can believe that maybe Ellie wouldn't want to, because they weren't in the process of attacking Oscar, and they were going to leave anyway, so it wouldn't really matter, and he's a kid, so he'd probably be traumatized by it. But I thought to myself, like, I sort of buy more they'd kill a witness, Even if that person wasn't participating, they still witnessed it. So I can believe, like, all of them, even if they weren't directly threatening Owen, would be killed.
I think in both of them, they seemed a little over the top. I kind of didn't buy that any bullies would be that. Don't go, bullies are horrific. And they really are. They can do some awful, awful things. I was kind of there like, really? You've gone from 0 to 16 that quickly? I mean, revenge element for striking the kid's ear. But the fact that then goes to, oh yeah, let's cut his eye out. You're like 12.
Potentially drown them as well, I think that the theme in the original and also in this one is that they are kind of touching upon is the whole theme, arguably the theme that like kind of humans are the real monsters, It's like we have vampires, but in reality humans are much more evil. And both films kind of get that across, mainly using the bully characters. Like the bullies in the original film, yeah, even though they're not as aggressive as the ones in Let Me In, they still, to me, felt like the closest thing to pure evil.
They were pure, uncomplicated evil, which then helped us connect with Oscar and make kind of like, oh, maybe they'll only kill bad people kind of thing. And then, it had an interesting impact for sure. Showed that, kind of every kind of character in the thing kind of had potential to be a monster. That was interesting to me.
I agree. That is a theme that's carried over in both films. It's slightly more spelled out in the remake because there's a scene where Owen asks his dad whether or not people can be evil, I think, but he doesn't really get an answer. And that kind of question can apply to anybody. It can apply to him, it can apply to Abby, it can apply to the bullies, and film, to me, I felt it actually managed to present a sense of grey morality whilst putting certain characters slightly more into the positions of being heroes and villains. It edged them closer, but it never fully embraced the whole notion of Owen is a hero, Abby is the villain, or the bullies are the villains and Owen's the hero. It was just a very dark and fucked up story. But again, I felt that the film emphasized the emotion and the sympathy a lot more, not only just for Owen, but also in terms of Owen and Abby's relationship. Like, to give you an example, the scene where Abby throws up after eating candy and Owen hugs her, I felt that was handled with more intimacy in the remake. Just in terms of the cinematography as well, how we got a lot closer than we did in the prior film. Little touches like that and other things as well added to the romance between the two of them.
I think that worked. I think it did definitely add to the kind of more romantic side of their relationship. But at the same time, it seemed a little bit, almost too much. I think the whole point of The Right One In, for me, was the development of that relationship, so that by the time that we got to the swimming pool scene, that felt like a solidified moment.
That moment at the pool was still, it doesn't carry the same heartwarming feeling that the original one did, but I do still feel like it's more interesting because, again, it's like this version of Abby is a more vicious, evil character, but she still goes back to save Owen anyway, and you kind of are left, and I was left wondering, is this actually because she cares about him, or is it because she just needs him to be the new Thomas, or is it a mixture of both? I was never quite sure how to feel. And it's like we got to the heart of their relationship, but we also got to see a darker edge to it as well, especially with the whole thing of implying that this is like a new cycle that's beginning, with how Thomas used to be a kid. I think that overall was what I preferred the most about it. Another big plus about the film as well, that I felt really strengthened it, was the direction in this one compared to the original. Because this film is not directed at all like the original film, but it still manages to, just like the original, draw you in. It goes for both a darker and a warmer colour palette. Both of those, I feel, work to its advantage very well. It's a very, very beautifully shot film.
And I agree that the added darkness works. For me, its added warmth doesn't, because it's only people trying to connect rather than fully connecting. And I think the problem, again, with I say it's a problem. I do like the film, but I think what changes the context of the story is that warmer colour palette, it makes the connection explicit rather than implicit. I think feel it a lot earlier in Let Me In. Like when I'm watching Let Me In, I feel that they're gonna end up more friendly from early on. While in Let the Right One In, I don't feel that, and I get less of a handle on Eli and what she is, because we don't get enough insight to what she is, and she's never shot with any particularly emotional colours involved. And I think by adding the emotion, because of how colour theory works and how our brains will respond to it, I knew what I needed to feel, or at least roughly what I was meant to be feeling.
I disagree, because that colour palette is fairly consistent, even in darker scenes.
I have a preference for the original because I had to work it out how I felt. It was a challenge to me. I had to work out what I thought about any of the characters, while Let Me In held my hand a little bit. And I liked Let Me In. I thought it worked really, really well. Chloe Grace Moretz is great.
Yeah.
Owen's okay.
I thought he was really, really good. I mean, he's not playing the same guys in the original.
It's a very different character.
Different performance, and that sticks out, I feel, but I think it sticks out in a good way. Anytime you saw him shirtless, all I could think is, wow, you look really, really emancipated. You just look really thin. and his kind of demeanor overall, everything about him in both films, the character of Oscar and the character of Owen is totally antisocial. There was a bit more of a sadness to his antisocialness in Let Me In. Whereas in the original one, I think, like, yeah, I wouldn't want to hang out with you. You seem like you might be an evil person, or at least you might become an evil person later in life. But with Owen, because they make his environment feel so distant, so sad, so lacking in love, as a result, I'm like, yeah, I can totally see him connecting to Abby, because Abby really is the one person in his life who is actually treating him like a person.
I think that, in a nutshell, is what I don't like as much about it. To me, it robs the macabre element of that relationship.
Oh, okay.
It robs it, because you can tell that, it's not like he becomes fascinated by the other one and develops that relationship actively. It's like, oh, she's kind of there to feel the need and the warmth and the whole. I find it much more interesting that Oscar had the warmth that he needed, but that didn't fulfill him.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more unstable relationship did. I find that a lot more interesting than the child who didn't have anyone kind of sort of gets someone. I think the original has the vampire as a tragic loner figure that needs people to survive but can never truly connect with them. And the psychological damage that does, I think that's what the original does. While the more recent one, again, it kind of plays into a lot of American vampire tropes, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I love an American vampire film, but I think it plays into the tropes of there are the people out there that find and understand each other and they can fill holes in each other's lives, whereas you don't get that sense as much with Let the Right One In. It's much more them projecting onto each other what they need as opposed to fulfilling each other's. It feels like less of a true relationship and more independent individuals trying to move forward. And I think that's what I like about the original, that it is just, it's people failing to connect because they don't know how and they never did.
You mean in terms of like the other relationships?
What I mean is with each other, they don't connect in a true way in Let the Right One In. Like, they do connect obviously, but they don't connect in a recognizable way to like normal people. I feel like Let Me In, they do, and to me it becomes slightly less interesting. I agree with you that Let Me In is a more emotional film. If that's what you're kind of going in for, I think Let Me In is the film that people will probably have an easier time with. But Let Me In, for me, I felt like it was emotional. It wasn't like overly emotional, but it had a good emotional crux to it. But more importantly, like it engaged my intellect a lot more. I was a lot more deductive watching it. I was a lot more interested in trying to work it out, and for me, that added an extra layer of enjoyment. That's what I think pushes it a little bit. I know I've seen people just been ragging on Let Me In, but I think it was really great.
To kind of go back to the direction a bit, and the reason why I'm pointing out it being emotional is because it does play up the horror elements a bit more, but it still understands that at its core, this is still a coming-of-age drama, and it still put that front and center. I think the thing I respect the most about it is that it wasn't afraid to commit to a slow burn tone, which the original film did too, but I feel like Let Me In especially commits to a very slow burn. It's about as long as the original film was. It's like an hour, 55 minutes. And I will admit that the original film was better paced, but I do respect the commitment to a slow burn. I respect the fact that a lot of the film is just focusing on these characters interacting or these characters doing what they need to do. And in the process, just made the moments of violence a lot more impactful because I just felt the build up to them. Because the increased violence in the film, I don't think would have worked if it was too frequent or if it just felt like it came out of nowhere. But in this film, I felt that there was suspenseful sequences that had a great payoff. I'll give you an example of the best ones in the film are Thomas's two murders. The ones in the cars were both really, really well directed. The cinematography in them was excellent.
I do really agree with that.
Like particularly the bit that totally goes wrong where, he's in the car and he's just like hiding in the back seat, and then all of a sudden somebody gets in, and then all of a sudden somebody notices and he has to kill them, and then he has to drive off, and then the car ends up crashing. That was a really excellently directed, really intense set piece. And I also appreciate what they do with perspective in the film as well. They play around with narrative perspective, but they also play around with cinematography perspective. Something I really loved is that seeing as how in this version they're emphasizing the distance between Owen and his mother. You never actually get a good look at the mother's face. There's one time you can kind of see her face, but it's in the dark and at night, so you don't really get a good look. I also liked as well, and this was kind of an interesting choice because both of the films, they hit a lot of the same beats. But what they do at the beginning and Let Me In is that they kind of start later on, and then we kind of work our way backwards. It gave you quite a like scary, mysterious perspective to what then ended up becoming a more emotionally charged sequence. It basically opens after Thomas has like poured the acid on his face, and we're in the ambulance, and then he's taken to the hospital, and then we see the cop coming in, and then he comes up and he's asking him questions, and he can't speak, and he tells him to write a note, and then he goes out, and then we see these like jumped off the building. But then later on, we get that from Thomas and Abby's own perspective. And what at first felt like a very mysterious, dark, objectively presented series of events then becomes this something that's more emotionally charged. We know that he poured the acid on his face. We know why. And we get to see that interaction between Abby and this version of Hakan. We get that scene again. And I felt that scene strengthened because of how we were shown it at the opening versus how we were shown it then.
I don't think it was necessary to tell the story. Yeah, it was interesting to get a dual perspective on it, but I don't think it added anything to the telling the story thematically. I understand that would get a structural hook. I get that. What I don't understand is how it makes the story better, because I was just as interested from the start of Let the Right One In, and it felt a bit more tragic because I didn't know it was coming. Obviously I would have known because I'd seen the original, but because I didn't know it was coming, it felt more like an in the moment decision, and I wasn't primed for it at all. So I was like, oh shit, Let Me In didn't give me that feeling. It didn't feel like a shock. It didn't, and the pain of it felt reduced because I'd already seen it but not gotten to feel it in the same moment. I think because it went chronologically, I felt connected with Hakan while he was committing his murder. I got a better feel of him having to decide to pour the acid in his face. While I admire the way that differs things up, but I don't think it adds to the themes of the film. And because of that, I don't think it works so well. There's nothing really about time in Let Me In. There is stuff about perspective. I can appreciate the choice from a perspective level, but I don't think that it does enough differ the perspective that I feel the horror and the pain of the moment.
I can see that. In general, the way that Matt Reeves helmed it felt like he was making his own film. It didn't feel like he was just rehashing the same style.
It did. That's true. And I think that did add to the film. It gave it a different horror vibe. I think it gave it almost like a neo-horror vibe, like a more modern horror film while retaining separation and intrigue. I think that's something Matt Reeves does really, really well, actually, just throughout his filmography in general, is he takes a genre that we know, throws in a couple of elements, he keeps it familiar but interesting. And I think that's how I would describe Let Me In. Familiar, but I was interested.
Looking at it, I was like, wow, you could not tell that this was helmed by the same guy who did Cloverfield. This is like completely the opposite in terms of style. But at the same time, not only is it appropriate, but it's also, again, very deliberate. I feel like the film, it allows you to get sucked into its world, and it allows you to get invested in what's going on.
It does step outside Owen a bit.
The one weakness that I did feel that Let Me In had, in comparison to the original, I preferred the subplot that they had in the original film, because in that one, I felt that there was more of an emotional connection. Whereas in this one, it was fairly standard, and we really knew nothing about the police officer that we were following. So as a result, I didn't really have much emotional investment in that part of the film. It doesn't take up like so much screen time that it like drags down the film, but I was less engaged when he was on screen. And that was something that I felt was stronger in the original film. In the original film, I cared a lot more about Lackey and his wife, whereas I didn't really have that same feeling.
Why I think the original felt a bit more complicated.
Even though you could argue that the death of this police officer is even worse because Locke was like breaking the law. He was going to, I mean, a vampire child, but still, he was going to go and kill a child. The officer that we focus on, I think he's nameless, doing his job and just trying to like, figure out what's going on. So in that sense, that makes the death more evil. But I would also argue it's just not quite as emotionally investing. I feel like the original subplot was very, very like, emotionally grounded. Whereas I didn't really get that same feeling. I was already invested enough in the main story, so this one didn't detract from it. But in the original one, I cared a lot more.
On a symbolic level, I get why they made it a police officer, because it does make Abby look a little bit more evil and complicate. Like on the surface, should complicate things more. But if I take away this emotional connection, we don't have any sort of divided loyalties at all. Yeah, character as such, like he is, but he doesn't get to be a fully realised character. I feel he's there to fulfil the function he's there for.
Again, I feel like that's the only thing that I would say was a big step down from the original film. So wrap it up finally. I really like both of the film. I had an emotional preference towards Let Me In, but Let the Right One in some ways is the stronger film. Regardless, I think both of them are really good.
I think they're both definitely worth a watch. I do have a preference for the original,
Mhm.
but Let Me In is definitely a worthy remake. It works.
Yeah.
Matt Reeves is always on point, so if
Yeah, I
you're
agree.
a director, you'll definitely like the film.
So next time we're going to be covering a film that's not so good, The Dinner. See ya.